So thanks very much for having me. I'm going to be mentioning some of the ideas from the previous presentations, but hopefully with a new twist. So this session is more about neurodesign and specifically what can we learn from emotion data that comes from the brain that can teach us about how to create better experiences that are human-friendly. The main principle behind the work that we do at True Impact is this idea that people will say what they think, but very often they're going to act on the way they feel. So to give you guys a little bit of background, my formal education is in neuroscience, and after conducting some experiments and just understanding the way emotion works in the brain, I decided to apply that to business, and I've worked in marketing for almost a decade. And in 2012, I married the two fields that I'm really passionate about into a neuro marketing company. So essentially what we are focusing on is what goes beyond the, the verbal aspect of things that people are able to say explicitly in a focus group or a survey, and really look at the way they feel as a way to kind of gauge their objective response to different stimuli. So again, the analogy here between the emotional and the rational is very similar to, it's like being stuck in traffic and your non-conscious brain is essentially telling you how to slam on the brakes. You don't have to think about it too much. You don't have to remember where the pedal is. It's just an automatic response. In contrast to that, your rational brain or your conscious response is like you're trying to parallel park. So it may take longer, it requires more effort, and it's slower. When we go about making decisions in the world, we look we look to motivation and other factors, but we really, as human beings, prefer to function at this non-conscious level. So most of the decisions you make on a daily basis are based on what you're familiar with, what is easy, what is comfortable. Right, and this is the most important data that you want to supplement when you are doing a lot of market research or usability testing. This emotion data can really give you that big picture on the way a person is feeling. So you want to know, ideally, where do they look, how do they feel, what do they say, to better be able to predict what they're going to do. In the last 8 years, we have worked with a number of CPG, retail, companies, as well as automotive, financial insurance, and so on. So we work primarily within North America, and we're based out of Toronto. And the main things we try to help with are, getting brands to be even noticed first and foremost. So how can you test whether you are being noticed? There's a number of eye tracking technologies that are available to measure if something gets attention or does not get attention. Can you trigger an emotion? This step is very important because once you have entered awareness, you have to enter the evaluation for relevancy. So can you actually trigger an emotion within the people that you have now captured attention from, and can you form a memory? If you're able to form a memory, you become familiar, you're much more likely to be selected next time. So these are the type of questions that neuroscience can help answer by looking directly at brain data. How this is actually done is a number of different ways. I'm going to kind of illustrate one of the methodologies here, but when you measure brain activity, the higher the quality of the device that takes the measurement, the more accurate the data that is recorded with it, obviously. So you want to use a tool that is not consumer grade, but it's also flexible and portable within a real world situation. One of the EEG devices that we prefer is the one featured here because it really provides clean data coming from the brain. The metrics that are available are motivation. So does the person have an approach response or an avoidance response to what they're seeing? Are they more likely to approach something or avoid it? Is it difficult to understand? So this is what we call cognitive load. If you're learning something for the first time, and some of you may be, when you're watching these presentations, your level of cognitive effort is higher. So what we want is we essentially want people to be cognitively engaged, but not to the point that it's overwhelming and stressful. And is the information presented exciting? Is there a level of what we call emotional intensity or arousal in the brain to help facilitate that memory encoding? So those are neural measures. Anything coming from the brain, such as measuring with an EEG or an fMRI device, is considered a neural measure. Anything coming from body, like facial coding, eye tracking, heart rate, these are all biomeasures. So biomeasures are usually supplementary to neural measures in that they're able to tell you where attention is going. However, not necessarily if that's a good thing or a bad thing, right? So one analogy would be, imagine you're looking at a picture of a train wreck. It doesn't necessarily mean you love it because you've looked at it for a long time. It is when you combine a biomeasure, such as eye tracking, with a neural measure that you know where attention is going and why. This is just to provide a quick visual of kind of how neuroscience research is conducted. Each participant's baseline is measured separately, and what we do is we take the difference between that person's baseline and their reaction, take that delta and average that across the group, run some statistical significance testing on it to make sure that the data is as accurate as possible, and report back on what the results were. And typically about 30, 60 people is kind of what you need for a traditional consumer neuroscience research study. And so the data that you get from the brain is combined with other things. So we have neurometrics, we have biometrics, and survey or explicit measures. What we're able to test, or what you want to actually, when you think about neuroscience research, you want to measure the content, such as a media, video, an image, an app, or something to do with context. So does this particular package get noticed at the store on the shelf, right? So real world customer experience. Measures from the brain include engagement, motivation. And so when we measure brain activity, this one is very interesting because motivational response is often correlated with the highest perceived product value and product quality. And this is a measure that has been pretty much proven time and time again to be the case within many published papers within neuroscience. Cognitive load, how difficult something is to understand, alertness, encoding into memory, short-term memory, long-term memory. So these are all things that are coming from the brain that give you an idea about how that person is feeling. Now, what is the body doing is where you need to look to biometrics. Eye tracking can tell you where people look at first, last, most, and least. Heart rate can tell you if something has a degree of emotional intensity that you want to elicit. Is this meant to be an exciting experience for the reader or user? Facial coding also gives you an indication about how people are feeling based on micro expressions, and usually a webcam would be reading these. When you connect the dots is really when you can actually make sense of how a person truly feels, is when you look at the brain, the body, and what they're able to say and willing to say afterwards, that you can actually really understand that big picture. So I'll give you an example of how neuroscience works and how the data looks like. When we're testing two different ad executions from, in this case, is from Miller course, we were looking at one execution, which is least favorable. It's when the ad pretty much pops up and takes over your full screen. Then we compare that with a ad that asks you if you need a gift while you're playing your app, and it comes at a moment of need, and it's permission-based, and there's also a reward-based interaction as well. When we look to cognitive load, essentially cognitive engagement, what we are seeing is that during the interstitial ad, which is the one that pops up and takes over your whole screen. So before the ad, if we adjust for baseline, we notice that this dip here is significant because people are essentially bored. So when that pop-up ad comes up, people are checking out or tuning out. And that's not necessarily the same case for an ad that they have chosen to watch in exchange for a reward. When we look to motivation, we are actually seeing how the interstitial pop-up ad elicits a little bit more of a motivation response. So this is a very interesting finding because the pop-up ad is supposed to be the one that, you know, our theory was that this is the least favorite, but we noticed there's a higher motivational response towards it. Now, if we didn't have eye tracking, we would be able to deduct very limited conclusions from this data. We would say, well, you know, the pop-up ad is, you know, more motivating or something. However, what we have learned is when you measure eye tracking, you can see where people look at most. And when you connect the dots between where people look and how they feel, in this case, you learn that people were motivated to actually close the ad. So that response was directed, what we, you know, this kind of race to X is what was happening with the pop-up ad, in contrast with the embedded opt-in, where attention is kind of scattered or shared across the page. People are even looking outside to make sure they haven't lost their game. And attention is also going to not just the brand, but also the countdown and to the next steps, right? So just because you look at something for a long time, it doesn't necessarily mean you like it. You really want to look at the brain data to kind of give you that perspective. Of course, it's, you know, depending on how much, you know, emotion data is available. But something else that was interesting in this example is that the pop-up, the interstitial ad, was motivating for the purposes of people closing it. However, post-ad, so when you go back to the game, this is the effect on context, right? So a poor ad execution can actually reflect negatively on the context or the app that it lives within, right? So when people go back to the game, their motivational levels are much lower to continue playing. So it's very important that we consider both the ad or message delivery as well as the context and the user on the other end of the phone, obviously, right? So this is one of those interesting kind of examples of the relationship between content and context. In addition to neuroscience services that are very, you know, readily available nowadays, we are looking at ways in which we can use the emotion data that we have gathered over the last 8 years to make predictions, basically. So without having to test any people, our question was, can we actually predict where people are going to look based on past eye tracking data and based on what we know about the visual system in the brain? The visual system in the brain is actually one of the most well understood parts of the brain. And we can predict with a high degree of accuracy what's going to grab attention. So that marketing challenge, the traditional marketing challenge, is be seen, be perceived as relevant, and ultimately be selected or be contacted. And a brand usually gets about 1 to 2 seconds to do that. So I want to give you some examples on how TrueScan or predictive eye tracking can actually be utilized. When you take an ad execution, in this case, it's a coupon page, and you test it, you notice attention is going to mostly the sandwich here in the back, the product in the back. The goal was to get attention on the product, you know, in the forefront, the Angry Whopper. And with a couple of design recommendations, the new iteration of the coupon page looked like this, where the background had a higher contrast, there was a single product, it was more simplified, and attention was going only to the actual item. This actually increased redemption rates year over year by 26%, and that translated in about 46% in gross profits from coupons. And you know, one of the lessons is that less is more, but you can actually quantify in dollars the value of that same, right? So you can actually see in this example, but also in many others, how marketing that is too cluttered and too busy and has too many calls to action, too many things that they want the person to do once they receive the piece, is not likely to be successful. People are confused, and if it's not quick and straightforward, they will deselect, or they will, you know, check out. In the example with emails, so for example, this is one of our financial clients, MD Financial Management, was looking to redesign their email campaigns, going from a setup that was very text heavy to one that allowed more negative space and also very specific headlines. So icons and bolded text and more white space. In terms of the actual test, the heat map shows quite a bit of focus on this paragraph, but attention is more scattered. So the more red the area is, the more likely attention is going to land there. After the fact, we can see attention going to the products and their logos. This type of message performed really well, and usually content that is laid out in a very comprehensive way tends to perform really well. They got 3 to 4 times their usual click-through rates. And finally, a direct mail piece from a services business. Hand & Stone Spa initially is sending out communications that look very busy, that contain quite a bit of information. But what's interesting about this piece is that it features a face of a model that is looking straight ahead. Now our brain, our Neanderthal brain, or our old brain, is designed to pick up faces in everything. So we are built to notice faces in clouds, on toast, on cars, you name it. So human faces have a very strong magnetism for attention, but it doesn't mean that that attention is going around or it promotes necessarily curiosity about the rest of the communication. So what we want to do is we want to use that idea, but use the facial expression to point toward a message, or even better, toward a call to action, right? Such as this promotion here. So when you do that, you're utilizing something that is embedded within, our brain anatomy, but you're also using that to guide or be intentional about where you want people to look. And so this type of change for them, it resulted in 25% increase of in-store service sales. And so this is a much larger branding campaign as well. So when it comes to Neuro design best practices, there are so many. I mean, we have a long list, but essentially some of the 3 that I featured today were the importance of a concise message when you're trying to communicate 2 or 3 or 4 calls to action, and you want somebody to call your 1-800, go to the website, come to the store, and do something else. It's just too much, and people will choose to do nothing. And second of all, the importance of simple design. When you are using high contrast and when you're allowing enough space for enough negative space, information is much easier to perceive and much more likely to convert, because you want the information to be noticed before it can be perceived as relevant, for it to have a chance to be selected. And finally, images of people are very salient and they're very powerful at drawing attention. However, they have to be used carefully, and you want to have some intention behind how you use images of actual people. Thank you so much for your attention. I would love to take some questions and hear your thoughts.
Do we have any questions for Diana, either via Q&A or raise your hand if you'd like to speak your questions? Any takers here? We'll give it a few more seconds. I'll ask you a question, Diana. Let me re-enable my video. Various speakers, including yourself in passing, have spoken about the diversity of information sources that are related or that one can call on to look at emotion, personal reactions, human feelings and states and all of that kind of stuff. Have you done any work, or have you thought about correlating the kind of things you do with neuroscience methods with information that is extracted via other methods, particularly if you can make some kind of temporal matching with something that someone has written or said or done with the things that are being measured here by the methods you've been describing?
Yeah, I think that would be something we would be interested to do. For the last 5-10 years, consumer neuroscience has been quite popular, but it is yet to be kind of bundled with some more data sources as well. So for example, if we can take the lessons from voice research or any other data set, I have noticed there usually are some sort of very interesting correlations, especially around cognitive load and motivation and those type of measures in the brain.
Yeah. All right, we have a question that was put in by Jacqueline Gordon. I've heard eye tracking isn't a good UX measurement. How or why do you focus on eye tracking technology?
I have not heard that eye tracking is not a good UX measurement. I mean, how else would you know what grabs attention in the first second? Our visual attention is automatic. So to know where people look at first and foremost can tell you a lot about where they're going to click next. So a tool that measures clicks and mouse movement is over here, but measuring eye tracking, especially predictive eye tracking, can tell you what's more likely to grab attention first and foremost and help you design before you build a full website and start tracking clicks. And that's a lot more effort. You can just create the JPEGs and test them before you go and you test how many clicks a green or orange call to action. I'm simplifying it, but the idea is when put together with other methodologies, it tells you information that you otherwise would never be able to know because people are not able to verbally say what grabbed their attention first and foremost with a high degree of accuracy.
All right. We have a question from Cheryl Wiesa, and I'm trying to enable her to speak. Cheryl, let's hear your question for Diana.
Thanks, Diana. That was a fantastic presentation.
Thanks.
I noticed that your research is on like product consumption, and I come from a world of behavioral health and trying to encourage people to change behaviors. Do you think that the concepts that you presented also might apply to other types of call to action besides purchases?
Yeah, the mechanisms by which you motivate somebody to exercise or eat healthy, the messaging may be different, but at the core, the path to behavior change is very similar. I mean, a brand like Colgate is trying to get people to stop buying Colgate and stop buying Sensodyne and move to Colgate, for example. You're trying to change a bit of a pattern or a habit, right? So as soon as we follow the same kind of steps, if you will, but the flavor is a little bit different. So if somebody's going to change their behavior, for example, they might be motivated to lose weight because their loved one is really pushing and advocating for it, and perhaps they're emotional about it. So they'll do it for other reasons, to be there for their children or what have you. You have to kind of identify for each change that you want people to make, kind of really what are those true factors that are going to motivate that change. And the most objective way we found is to present images and scenarios and see what the brain naturally reacts to within that first second, because that really gives you the first objective glimpse into later on how do you structure a whole communication campaign that will drive that behavior change. So yeah, absolutely. I think you can definitely use these tools for good. Most often it is the common brands that you're familiar with who are sponsoring this type of work, but we also work with quite a few nonprofits to try to drive their fundraising efforts and to help optimize them.
Fantastic, thank you.
Hey, Diana, I have one question if you don't mind. So, I work mostly on NLP, and we work on, psychological traits and emotion, sentiments, etc. And we are always in this kind of depth. I didn't find like a good study, but we are always like, how much is it in the text? Because sometimes we add data from voice and we're like, oh, suddenly we have more information here. So maybe our original gold labels, maybe they were not good because whoever annotated the data did not have that information, and there was. So I was wondering whether you ever had a chance to evaluate something like, if I just take an NLP model and I just have the text, how much am I missing in general? I'm pretty sure I'm missing some cases, but is there any quantification of how much is that?
I don't think I have like a number for you, but I have seen people have difficulty expressing exactly how they feel. And it's almost like acknowledging how they feel and expressing it. There's two different mechanisms in the brain. So when you have that gut feeling reaction towards a product, it happens, and we measure the brain 256 times a second. So we know with a high degree of accuracy, within about 300 milliseconds, people have a gut feeling response to what they're hearing, if they like it, don't like it. Now, if they're able to recognize that, it depends on that person. Usually it's very hard. And the other thing is people project into the world a better version of themselves. So many times you have to get that data in a way that's not biased, right? So such as in a focus group where everyone's talking, you know, people want to say, yeah, I'll use recycled products, and yes, I'll pay more for an eco-friendly dish soap or whatever. Because that's who they want to portray, but that's not necessarily the reservation they have in purchasing that. It might not even be the price. It might be deeper, it might be cultural, it might be a bias, right? So you can more easily uncover biases by looking at brain data, but when you connect the dots between the brain data and what people are saying is where you actually, I believe, get a lot more power in prediction.